So as of early this morning, on Sunday, March 1st, it became apparent that, well, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was no longer with us. For over 36 years, he has not just been the leader of the Islamic Republic, but for many people, the system. He was the ultimate decision maker, its ideological anchor, and the final absolute authority on war, peace, and survival. But he is gone. His compound in central Tehran, known as the Bayt-e-Rabari, or House of Leadership, was struck in one of the opening waves of the joint US-Israeli airstrikes on Saturday. Satellite imagery showed severe structural damage to the complex, and initially, as I say, Iranian officials insisted that he had moved somewhere safe. Then announcements came that he would give this televised address, and the state TV doing what it could to keep the narrative. But he never appeared, and Israeli officials began signaling late on that night that there were many signs that he was no longer alive. American officials quietly then echoed those sentiments, and hours later, Trump tweeting it out on his Truth Social before Iranian state television around sort of 1:32 o'clock UK time confirmed it. The supreme leader is gone. And so, to put it bluntly, the state TV had said that he had drunk the sweet, pure draught of martyrdom, whatever that means. They've now instigated a 40-day mourning period, although given the rate at which things continue to escalate, and by the time that this goes live, things may have changed yet again. Indeed, at the time of recording, there seems to be indications that the Iranians are open to peace talks and that the Trump administration may be willing to entertain said peace talks. So are the more restrained parts of what remains of the Islamic Republic coming through? Now, official ceremonies have also begun immediately, but alongside these scenes, of course, of mourning is another reality that there is tons and tons of celebration from Tehran to Karaj and other cities, and people have been expressing hope, adulation, and the ends of decades of this repression. So two completely different emotional realities unfolding simultaneously, the official grief from the loyalists, but the private relief from those who lived under Khamenei. Because for millions of Iranians, Khamenei was not the leader. He was the face of this system that has ruled through surveillance, force, and absolute oppression. And in my personal opinion, it's a good thing to see him gone. But of course, it leads us to what happens next. As usual, I try to record my videos, but in this case, this isn't as scripted, much like the update yesterday. This is a bit more blunt. To understand why Khamenei's death matters, you have to understand the role that he played. He came to power in 1989, only 10 years after the revolutionary state had been created in 1979. But he didn't just preserve it, he transformed it into something far more resilient and far more entrenched. He was instrumental in creating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. And not just with the military force, but with the political, the intelligence and economic empires that controlled vast sections of Iran's economy, but also their proxy network. The IRGC became responsible not only for defending Iran externally, but for suppressing absolutely dissent internally. As we saw in January, protests have been crushed, opposition movements absolutely systematically dismantled, and thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or just completely killed. And the security crackdowns that killed tens of thousands reinforced the regime's willingness to use unlimited force to survive, but also the fact that they were having to resort to, for the first time in known memory, recent memory. Now, internationally, Khamenei built Iran into this regional power through the asymmetric means that we grew to know of it. He constructed these networks of allied militias, the proxy groups across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza, otherwise known as the Axis of Resistance after the October 7th events. It allowed Iran to project far more beyond its borders, but always avoid that direct conventional confrontation, leveraging the useful concept of plausible deniability. But this entire system depended heavily on the centralized authority, and Khamenei was not merely symbolic, therefore. He was the ultimate arbitrator, the final decision maker, and the man who balanced the competing factions, or what's left of them, controlling the military and ensuring regime cohesion. Remove him, and the entire system faces its most serious test. But crucially, the regime has been preparing for this moment, because Khamenei understood very, well, unsurprisingly, that he was target number one. During last year's 12-day war, Israeli strikes assassinated various nuclear scientists, some senior commanders, and key security officials. And so it became clear, even to the Supreme Leader himself at that point, that he has to take necessary contingency plans to establish a line of succession, to think about the day after tomorrow. And that's what we're seeing implemented now with this transitional government, as it's being called by the president, who is, at least right now, still with us, and are enacting it. The clerics, the senior individuals who will be making the relative decisions as to who takes up the mantle. During the 12-day war, he reportedly spent extended periods inside what we thought were fortified bunkers, but clearly not enough against US and Israeli hardware. Khamenei assembled what's known as the Assembly of Experts, this powerful clerical body responsible for selecting the Supreme Leader to be ready to act immediately in the event of his death. Now, according to some, potential successors have already been identified, 3 or 4 senior clerics and figures acceptable to the overall security establishment. So it's not, of course, improvisation. This was long-term considered planning. And because the regime's greatest fear was not about the assassination itself, it was about instability, a power vacuum, fragmentation. And that's why within hours of his death, the Iranian officials have announced this formation of the Provisional Leadership Council to oversee this transition and ensure this continuity of authority. And that's why, as I said in my video yesterday, it's problematic though, because Trump wants to claim regime change, or that the primary actors involved with this current form of the regime are all gone. But how do you know where to draw the line? How many people do you have to kill? How many senior individuals have to be removed before you think adequately the job is done? Now, this leadership council has made it very clear in their messaging that the system remains intact, the regime survives, and what they're doing with these arbitrary strikes across the Middle East are perhaps part of that strategy. So what matters most here is that the Islamic Republic was never designed to depend entirely on one man, even though he is much the face of it. Over time, power has shifted towards more institutions, especially the IRGC, the intelligence services, and these clerical networks whose survival is tied directly to the survival of the regime itself. These actors do not just simply disappear because the supreme leader is gone. Their authority, their wealth, and of course their personal survival depend on maintaining the system. So that means their instinct will not be surrender or collapse, but consolidation. No, consolidation can depend on what form. Do they take a more restrained version, engaging the Americans and draw down diplomatically, or do they continue to up the ante? To demonstrate more specifically, though, about continuity and to prove to both domestic and foreign adversaries that the regime remains firmly in control. Now, the strikes did not only kill Khamenei, they killed several senior figures, including the defense minister, and other high-ranking military commanders and members of the defense leadership. This is therefore not simply an attack on the one man, it is an attempt to absolutely decapitate the entire structure itself. And Iran's system, though, has been designed to withstand precisely this kind of shock, albeit even if we're still all shocked when it happens. Iran's military command structure is pretty decentralized, and operational authority can be delegated according to some. Units across the country can continue functioning even without direct orders from the top, and that's what makes earlier strikes on Oman so concerning, is that the foreign minister basically just said bluntly on state media that they told them not to target Oman, and yet military entities have chosen to do so. So whilst you have this resilience that reflects decades of preparation, the gaps in the chain of command are, on the other hand, a major problem. Iran's leaders have always assumed that confrontation with the US or Israel might one day threaten the regime's survival directly, but as with everything, you cannot account for every single scenario perfectly. Now, there is a widespread assumption that removing the leader of an authoritarian regime could mean collapse, but history repeatedly shows that this isn't necessarily the case. Decapitation strikes disrupt command structures. They do create confusion, but they rarely destroy the regimes outright. Look at ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Taliban even. Leaders were killed, the organizations, though, survived. Leadership was replaced, the system continued, and in some ways it got worse. Regimes are built on ideology, institutional power, shared survival interests that do not depend on one sole individual. They depend on these networks, the structures, and the incentives tied to survival. Iran's regime, above all else, is designed for survival, and survival is now the regime's overriding objective. It's its only objective. Because from this perspective, it's no simply a military confrontation. It is an existential one. Already Iran is retaliating across the board, and the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 1/5 of oil supply passes, now becomes the main flashpoint. Iran cannot defeat the US or Israel in conventional military terms. That is not its strategy, therefore. Its strategy is to try to change the nature of the conflict, not to win outright, but to expand the battlefield across the region. Through what remains of its proxy forces, particularly economic disruption, whether or not cybernetic operations can still have an impact, and the sustained attacks on tourism or economically sensitive infrastructure can raise the costs to such an extent that the markets react when they open tomorrow, and that the allies that have been supporting of the Americans in the past feel so much pressure that they seek the Americans to pull back. Now, it is about the strategic survival for Iran, and as always, if your back is up against all as much as it is, well, then you don't have really much to lose. And if Iran can make the cost of removing the regime too high, then survival itself becomes a form of success. But the greatest danger may not actually lie outside Iran, but within it, because leadership decapitation creates three possible outcomes, as I've been inferring throughout this. The first scenario is continuity, that this assembly of experts appoints some kind of successor quickly. The regime therefore stabilizes, and the Islamic Republic continues in some form, which much to the disagreement or perhaps problem for Trump. The second scenario is consolidation, but by the hardliners, by the IRGC. The IRGC could emerge as the dominant power center, transforming Iran into a more overtly military-dominated state, sort of think a military junta, as we've seen in Myanmar. Much more aggressive, much more ideological, less constrained, and willing to go even further than what we've seen. But then there is the third scenario, fragmentation, and one I am genuinely concerned about because of how slippery the slope is. Internal power struggles between clerics, military factions, political elites leads to regional leaders trying to assert their own autonomy. Separatist movements begin emerging. Civil conflict. This is the critical point, which then also brings in external actors like Turkey, in the case of the Kurds, or Pakistan with the Balochistan. Regimes often fail not when leaders die, but when there is a credible alternative ready to replace them. In Iran, there is no such alternative, at least clearly. The opposition is fragmented and lacks institutional control, which creates a vacuum far more likely to be filled by the strongest internal actors, not yet decimated by American-Israeli strikes. Maybe both those actors will take the necessary precautions of this, but in the short term, the regime could likely survive. It has prepared for this moment. It has the contingency plans. It has loyal security forces. But in the longer term, the uncertainty grows. Khamenei was more than just leader. He was the central pillar, and his authority was absolute. His legitimacy rooted in those decades of control, far longer than the person who actually led the original revolution. His successor may inherit the power, but may not necessarily his authority. And this may be the most important distinction, uncertainty of all. Because Khamenei ruled not just through formal power, but through accumulated legitimacy and personal networks built over decades of being in that position. So any successor who doesn't have those creates spaces for internal rivalries to really intensify, for the factions to compete, and over time for internal tensions to prove much more consequential than any set of external military strikes. The death of Khamenei marks the end of an era in Iran, but it does not mark the end of the Islamic Republic or where we are right now. Instead, it marks the beginning of the most uncertain chapter, one that could last a couple of days if negotiations lead somewhere, or potentially weeks, if not months, as some American senior personnel seem to have inferred, and one where the consequences will extend far beyond Iran than they already have done. It's about whether the system that Khamenei built can survive without him, and how adaptable, malleable, flexible the Islamic Republic can prove itself to be in the darkest of hours. But we'll have to wait and see. Thanks for watching this video, everyone. If you enjoyed it, do give the video a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all probably tomorrow for another update. And you can find videos, live streams that I'm going to be doing with guests on an intermittent basis, maybe 2 to 3 a day, short, snappy, to get a certain update, a certain angle on something. And, well, regular programming may well resume, but right now we're in unprecedented times and it requires unprecedented coverage. See you soon.